Well, now let's go back to Israel. King Jehu and his descendants, they reigned over Israel longer than any other reigning family. And the reason for this is because of the promise that God made to Jehu in 2 Kings 10 and verse 30, and then repeated in 2 Kings 15 and verse 12, where he says, "Because you have done well in doing what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your sons shall sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." Well, Jehu certainly made his mark on history. He certainly had carried out God's command to do away with the household of Ahab. But then when we look at his descendants, they didn't really do that much. They were just kind of lame ducks. They didn't accomplish much of anything for the kingdom while they were on the throne. Well, when Jehu passed away, his son, a man by the name of Jehoahaz, became the king of Israel. And he reigned for a period of 17 years, but just like his father. We read in 2 Kings 13 and verse 2 that Jehoahaz did evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. He did not depart from them. We find that because of the sin that was taking place in the land of Israel, mainly the practice of idol worship, we find that God's anger was kindled against them. And because of this, he allowed, just as he had with Judah, he allows Syria to start coming in, conquering parts of Israel as well. And we find that this took place over two different generations. It happened during the reigns of the Syrian kings Hazael and Ben-Hadad. But we find that when Syria came in and conquered those areas, they began to oppress the people that lived in those areas greatly. I mean, it was a very... They faced a lot of persecution. It was a very difficult place to live during that time. And so eventually, Jehoahaz, he recognizes what's going on, and he goes to the Lord and he pleads for God to provide some type of relief. Well, the Lord hears the cries of Jehoahaz, and the text says that he provides a deliverer. I find it very interesting that the text does not tell us who this deliverer is. It just says that he provides a deliverer. And as a result, the people were able to live in security once more. Now, many sources believe that this deliverer was actually the son of Jehoahaz, another man by the name of Joash. You see these names repeated over and over in many of these books. Joash would succeed his father on the throne. And as we can read later in the account, and what we'll see as well when we get into discussing that king, he did a lot to bring that nation back to peace. And so there are a lot of people that believe that this deliverer that stepped in during the time of the reign of Jehoahaz was actually what we would refer to as the prince of the kingdom. He was the one that stepped in and took charge and brought about this peace and security. But we find that even though God heard his prayer, even though God provided a deliverer, even though he took away the oppression of Syria, we find that Jehoahaz would not stop the practice of idolatry. They continued to engage in it. He continued to promote it. They continued to walk in the same sins. And as we see in 2 Kings 13 and verse 6, they kept the wooden image of Asherah in the city of Samaria. This was a female goddess that would have been worshipped. It was the female counterpart of Baal. And so this was set up, and they continued to worship this false god. So what does God do next? Because there's no gratitude being shown, since there's no response to this answered prayer, God steps in and takes measures to greatly weaken the military of Israel. And we find that eventually they are left with only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. A much smaller military than what they once had. A force that had really no way to go up against the strength of the Syrian army. And so any battle that they faced, Syria was victorious. And so they were continually losing more and more territory once again to Syria. Well, we find that by the time that Jehoahaz died, essentially the situation that God had delivered them from had already come back. Those areas that God had allowed them to reconquer, the peace that they had been destroyed because Syria had come back once again. Well, when Jehoahaz died, we're told that he was buried in the city of Samaria, which was the capital of Israel at that time. And his son, Joash, or as we see sometimes referenced, Jehoash, began to reign in his place. All right, a couple of applications that we see from Jehoahaz. Folks, when God answers your prayer, show a little gratitude. When God answers prayer, show gratitude. Jehoahaz cried out to God for deliverance from this oppression. God heard his prayer and answered his prayer. God didn't have to do that. Especially the way that he was leading that kingdom. He sure didn't have to answer that prayer, but he did. He provided a tremendous blessing to that nation. But rather than recognize the blessing that God had provided and show gratitude to God by being faithful to God, they just continued on in their idol worship. They continued that false way. Well, folks, when we recognize that God has blessed us, when we recognize that God has answered our prayers, we always need to return with praise and gratitude.